I wonder how his fellow Jews reacted when St. Paul spoke about the idea of justification in our first reading today. They must have felt offended or even extremely offended by his words, the way the Scribes and the Pharisees felt offended by the words of Jesus in today's gospel. In our gospel, Luke tells us that from that time on, they began to act with hostility towards him. There were only two kinds of people in this world as far as St. Paul was concerned. And here he is speaking like a typical Pharisee. Dati naman siyang Pariseo. For him, there are the chosen people on the one hand and the Gentiles on the other hand. Dalawang klaseng tao lang. The chosen people and the Gentiles. Gentiles. That is how they refer generically to the rest of humanity. Ibig sabihin, ang mga hindi Hudyo. And I find it funny, that tayo mga Kristiyano, we inherited that term from the Jews. And now we are also referring to the rest of humanity as Gentiles. Especially when we're talking about mission. Year of mission ngayon. And, we love to talk about MISSIO AD GENTES. That's the Latin translation for mission to the Gentiles. As if we were not Gentiles ourselves. St. Paul is actually criticizing an attitude that he himself represented before he was converted, meaning while he was still a Pharisee. Yung bang mindset na, si Yahweh ay Diyos lang siya ng bayang pinili. He is God only of the chosen people, Israel. In our first reading today, St. Paul asks, does God belong only to the Jews? Does he not belong to the Gentiles too? And then he declares, isa lang ang Diyos. God is one. And he insists that this one God will justify both the Jews and the Gentiles. And, yun ang iniisip kong offensive for the Jewish people in his audience. Because it was unthinkable for his Jewish audience who presupposed that their being chosen people meant that only they would be saved. Sila lang maliligtas. Why? Because only they received the Ten Commandments, the law. And it was through their observance of the Torah, or the law, that they were supposed to achieve righteousness that would save them from sin. And this is what Paul precisely is challenging. Sabi ni St. Paul, all have sinned. Lahat tayo nagkasala. Lahat makasalanan. This reminds me of Jesus, what he said to the people who were condemning the woman caught in adultery. Remember, sabi niya, the one among you without sin, be the first to cast a stone. Because they were condemning the woman as a sinner. Teka, I want to make sure that you are not sinners yourselves. So the Jews were no better. How often had they been reminded by the prophets of their failure to keep the commandments? And so, St. Paul now says, with Jesus, salvation is offered to both the Jews and the Gentiles, meaning to all. And he says, they are justified freely by His grace through the redemption of Christ Jesus. Masyado tayong nasanay by the word justified by faith, but actually he says justified by grace. And this reminds me of that passage sa book of Deuteronomy where the writer is reminding Israel bakit sila pinili ni Yahweh, why they're called the chosen people. Let me quote it. It's very interesting. Deuteronomy 7 verse 7. It was not because you are greater than other people that the Lord set His heart on you and chose you. For you are really the least of all people. It was rather because the Lord loved you. In short, parang sinasabi dito sa kanila, ay, hindi naman kayo pinili dahil magaling kayo, dakila kayo. Kaya kayo pinili, kinahabagan kayo ng Panginoon. Because they were being oppressed as slaves. They were the least. You know, I have often heard of parents talking this way when one of their children resents the special attention that the other sibling might be getting. Alam naman natin, may mga bata na yung nagtatampo minsan sa parents nila, accusing them of favoritism, di ba? I remember one mother struggling to explain to her eldest na nagtatampo. Sabi niya, mahal ko kayong pareho, kayong magkapatid. Okay, I know. Your father and I tended to give your brother more time and attention than you. But it was not because we love you less. It is rather because your brother has a disability and he needs a little more attention. Like, remember? We did not even need to tutor you sa mga homework mo dahil kayang-kaya mo. You did very well in school. In fact, I think you turned out to be a very responsible boy because you yourself looked after your brother and you gave him all the care and attention that he needs. And we are very proud of you for that. That's very consoling for some children to hear, lalo na kung nagtatampo, thinking that they are loved less. St. Paul is disappointed that his fellow Jews have convinced themselves na sila lang ang maliligtas. They had forgotten what they had been blessed for, what God had chosen them for. They had been blessed to be a blessing for the rest of humanity because God wanted to save the whole world, not just Israel. And something goes terribly wrong when people begin to think of love as a reward for their good efforts or the good things that they have done. They tend to get programmed by a sense of merit. They never develop a sense of grace. Kawawa yung taong walang sense of grace. They are the kind of people who would say, I don't owe anything to anyone. Lahat ng meron ako, tinrabaho ko, a product of hard work. Sometimes people even call themselves a self-made man, as if such a human being exists. Parang lalaki ba yung taong walang nag-alaga sa kanya? Sometimes we need to hear from God what the prince said to Cinderella in that stage musical. You remember the song, Do I love you because you're beautiful? Or are you beautiful because I love you? Isn't that nice? Yes. It is as simple as that. Paul is trying to point out what saves you or what justifies us is not our righteousness or our faithful adherence to the law. We are not saved because we work hard for it. We are saved only by grace, by God's generous, unconditional, and merciful love. In reality, we are no better than others. We are all sinners. And I think it's the most Christian thing to say. Even when we feel close to God, we have to have the humility to say, we are sinners ourselves. That is what we heard in today's responsorial psalm. Psalm 130. Sabi niya, if you, O Lord, should mark our guilt, who can stand? Kasi alam naman ni Lord, wala naman tayong may tatago sa Kanya. Meaning, if we are to be judged according to what we deserve, if we are to be judged really according to our merits, I wonder who will be found deserving. Remember the film, Tinimbang ka, ngunit kulang. Baka lahat tayo pag tinimbang, kulang na kulang. Even Mother Mary, in her Magnificat, she said, for he has looked upon his servant in her lowliness. She's not saying she's righteous, she deserves to be magnified by the Lord. And that comes close to the motto of Pope Francis, wretched but chosen. Alam nyo, mga kapatid, this is a very good reminder for Christians who boast about being saved. Those who think they are assured of heaven because they fulfill their religious obligations. And that others who do not will surely go to hell. You know, this attitude is one of the pet peeves of Pope Francis. Yung mga taong, kung mag-isip the Eucharist is an exclusive meal for the righteous. I think people who think this way must listen carefully to the words of consecration where Jesus says, His blood is poured out for you and for many. Kasi baka naririnig lang natin, His blood is for us. No. For many. So that sins may be forgiven. Meaning for sinners too. He is not offering His life only for the salvation of the good, the righteous, and the deserving, but rather for the redemption of sinners. Well, Paul, as it were, is telling us in a simplified way of saying it, it's not what you do for God that saves you. It is rather what you allow God to do for you. Let me repeat that. It's not what you do for God that saves you. It is rather what you allow God to do for you. It is only by God's unconditional love, by God's grace, and His readiness to empty Himself totally, to suffer and to die for us, even while we are sinners, that we are justified.